Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Barton. I'm here at North Carolina State University and handling the logistics for today's webinar. To get things started, I just want to remind you a copy of today's slides are available on the Forestry Webinar portal where you joined. And I have also pasted that link again in the chat for those that are just now joining, so you can get a copy of those slides. It will download the file to your computer or tablet directly from that link I posted. Also, today we'll be taking questions and answers at the end of today's presentation. We'll be using the Q&A feature here of Zoom. So as you get questions today, please type them into the Q&A feature and we will do our best to get them answered within the time allotted for the presentation today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the host for today, Colby Lambert. Colby?
Thanks, Bob. On behalf of the North Carolina Tree Farm Program, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on an overview of bottomland hardwood forest. Our speaker today is Dr. David Merker. He has worked as a consulting forester for 13 years and as an extension forester with the University of Tennessee for 25 years. Through extension programs, he educates landowners, loggers, foresters, teachers, youth, and society about sustainable forest management. He is a fellow with the Society of American Foresters, has received the National Family Forest Education Award, and was chosen as the 2020 National Extension Forester of the Year. He recently developed a series of educational videos titled Back Porch Forestry that offer forestry education in the non-formal setting of his back porch. So at this time, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Merker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Barton and Colby and North Carolina Tree Farm and all the woodland viewers that are out there today. I'm happy to represent the University of Tennessee School of Natural Resources. This presentation is just an overview of bottomland hardwoods. As extension foresters, we are typically generalists, capable of covering a broad array of all things trees and forest management. There are scientists that spend a career with this topic, wetland ecologists and hydrologists, for example, and they are the real keepers of knowledge. However, I have worked extensively in bottomland hardwoods and have conducted some research. There will likely be much new information for the landowner audience in the audience today, and some new or maybe renewed information for the professional viewers. And finally, I'd like to say that I'll use the terms bottomland hardwoods and bottomland forests and wetlands interchangeably, although obviously not all wetlands are forested. So let me go ahead and share the presentation, and I think we can launch into this. Okay, let's go ahead and begin by defining what we mean by bottomland forests. These are forested properties that occur adjacent to rivers and streams, specifically in the southeastern part of the United States. Sometimes these are narrow, sometimes these are expansive, and of course, sometimes they're more hydric or wetter than others. Here's a depiction, a figure that shows, well, the four physiographic regions of the Southeast, and superimposed on that in this kind of darker green color is where the bottomland hardwoods are located. And so it begins with the Wabash River area in southern Illinois, hits the Ohio River, comes down through the Mississippi Basin, and then travels all across the coastal plain. Now, understand that these are the major bottomland hardwood regions. Of course, they come inland some with the various tributaries. In fact, I'm located right here in West Tennessee at the West Tennessee Research and Education Center. It's mostly a row crop experiment station, but 1/3 of our acreage is bottomland hardwood. So it extends, includes a great deal more than what's shown here. We have lost a lot of our historical wetlands. Farmers were actually paid to drain these wetlands for agricultural purposes in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. discovered that probably wasn't a real good idea. But in the process, we've actually lost about half of our wetland areas in the United States as we developed this nation. Now, I need to spend a little time on this figure. It's kind of busy. There's a lot going on, but specifically, there's three things that need to be covered here. You can see the low water line and the high water line. Majority of the year, of course, it's going to be hovering around this low water level. But periodically, once or twice a year, maybe half a dozen times, there'll be this inundation of floodwater that kind of moves in. This is not terribly concerning to me as a forester as far as it comes to the trees and their survival. Most trees can tolerate some flooding, provided it's not too deep and not too long. It's the duration that we're concerned about. Fast-moving water that moves in it includes a lot of oxygen, and oxygen is what's important to the roots of the trees. And so that isn't the issue. Oftentimes it's this low water line where the water just kind of ponds and stays there a long time where the oxygen is used up. And that's what limits a lot of the trees that can grow on these sites. Now, secondly, you'll notice there's two water bodies here. There's the actual channel itself of the river, and then we've got this oxbow off to the other side. And you tend to think that that's all we have, two bodies of water. Of course, an oxbow is where the river channel at one time once was, or maybe it's trying to recreate that. But what we oftentimes don't understand is that in between these two, it's full of water too. Oftentimes you're standing on water. There's a tendency for these two waters of body to reach equilibrium. So in a sense, you're almost walking on the river when you're working in some of these bottomland areas. The third thing that I want to focus on, you'll notice there's different alluvial deposits in these bottomland hardwood forests. You'll notice that ever so slight changes in elevation can have a drastic effect on the species composition. So for instance, right here, we've got the water body, and as a rain event occurs, of course, the water picks up speed, and it picks up heavier soil particles, the sand. And as soon as it reaches this natural levee, the water disperses and that heavier sand is deposited. So oftentimes the levee is composed of a great deal of sand and organic matter, rich soil, good productivity for trees. But the type of trees that can grow here can be completely different than the type of trees that can grow maybe just 50 yards away in this back swamp area. At the research center where I'm at, you can go, we have an area just like that. And in the middle of the summer, when it's plenty dry, you can take a soil probe and go into this area and plug down within 6, 12, or 18 inches, you'll find standing water there. So that gets back to that slow moving, stagnant water where the oxygen gets depleted, and it really limits the types of trees that can grow here. You will note, though, that you can move trees adaptable to this site to the levee, but not the other way around. So let me give you an example of what I mean when I talk about the alluvial deposits and how it affects things. This is a bottomland site in West Tennessee, and for the foresters in the audience, you might be able to pick out the sycamore. It's primarily sycamore with some box elder and maybe an occasional sweet gum. But right here in the middle of it is a tulip poplar, and if we know anything about tulip poplar or tulip tree, it does not prefer wet feet at all. In fact, it doesn't like dry or wet sites. The soils need to be just right. So the fact that it's here tells me we've got a pocket that's fairly well drained. Of course, you're looking at it two-dimensionally. If you were to back up and look at it, you could see there'd be an ever so slight rise right here in the soil. So again, a lot of variation in the soil type, and that affects the species that can be present. Well, bottomlands, of course, are critical to all of the ecosystem and all society. A number of benefits. Of course, they prevent downstream flooding. Just the fact that the trees are there are allowing some of that water to be slowed down and absorbed. Of course, they filter pollutants. This is particularly important as you get near urban areas where we're at in Jackson. All kinds of pollutants can be found on the streets and so forth that eventually run off into these bottomland areas. Of course, they curb soil erosion. They store excess water in the process and then gradually release it for the benefit of wildlife and the ecosystem. The wildlife biologist can give you an array of benefits for wildlife as it relates to these bottomland habitats. Of course, they do sequester and store carbon, which moderates the weather. That's important to all of us. And sometimes they can do it very rapidly because the productivity on these sites can be impressive. And of course, the faster the trees are growing, the faster they are storing carbon. So that's important too. As a forester, I can't omit this. They do provide timber products and can produce them rapidly. And then finally, of course, there's a whole host of recreational opportunities that we all enjoy and benefit from in these systems. Well, traditionally, as I indicated, about 3 decades, they were focusing on clearing these bottomlands to try to get them in row crop production. They began to realize maybe in the 1980s they had gone too far, and that's when the protection and even restoration of the wetlands began. You might be familiar with the Conservation Reserve and the Wetland Reserve programs. Millions of trees were planted in the Southeast on these sites. Early on, we didn't really know what we were doing. This was 50 years ago. It had a lot of failures, but we've come a long way, and I'll share some techniques with you as we're going along. And then more recently, of course, they're used for wetland mitigation. If a Fortune 500 company wants to come in and develop a new manufacturing plant, they might gobble up some wetland. In the process, they can offset that through wetland mitigation. So a lot of focus on wetlands and bottomlands, as you'll see. So here we have the research center that I'm located at in Jackson in West Tennessee. And I want you to focus on the upper left-hand corner. This is a 120-acre bottomland field that at one time was all forested. In the 1950s and 60s, the agricultural engineers came in and they dug a channel all the way through the field that dumps out into a river over here. They then tiled the field so that it would dump into this channel. And excuse me, and then they attempted to farm it. Well, I was told by the director of the center that at the time we planted it, you can see there's row crop stubble out there, corn stubble. And he said that was about the 6th crop they'd had in 50 years. And so they could plant it and the crops would grow. And then at some point, you're going to have a growing season flood that would kill the crop. And of course, the researchers just abandoned it because they couldn't get research out of it. So it was just kind of being farmed for the purpose of keeping it open. And then in 2004, we planted 51,000 trees on this site. Now, important to this is if you want to have success planting sites like this that are going to get flooded, half a dozen times a year, there's a lot of soil compaction here. And so we subsoiled it in advance of planting it with an 18-inch shank to bust up that hard pan. These sites, the soil can be very compacted. We planted it on a 10-foot by 10-foot grid, and here's the exact same site 3 years later. So it's primarily oaks that we were planting, bottomland oaks, in the same site during the same growing season. You can see why we call it bottomland forest. And we've had excellent survival through the years. We are now in our 20th year. And here's the site in 2020. Now, what you can't see here, and another part of it back there, I actually planted every 3rd row in loblolly pine. And the purpose of that was the loblolly would serve as trainer trees to kind of force our more desirable oaks up. But then in addition, they can be thinned out for an early income to help cash flow the thing. And so here's an actual short video that shows what I'm talking about. So this was a row of pine, and then we have 2 rows of overcup oak, and then another row of pine, and that's repeated. And so this is a 6-second video that would show a feller buncher that's actually grabbed a bunch of these trees, cut them, and he's driving out of the woods with them. So that's a possibility of actually mixing hardwoods with softwoods for a number of benefits. Well, my goal as a forester, I guess, is to make sure we're going to have trees for the future. In a simple sense, that's what I tried to achieve in this 39-year career. Working with private landowners, you soon realize that in order to achieve that goal of having trees for the future, that landowners better be able to make money off their forest land, or they might convert it to another use. And so oftentimes, whether it's on upland sites or bottomland sites, I really like to throw trees into 3 different value groups. And in the bottomland sites, what I consider the higher value trees, king of all of them is going to be our cherry bark red oak. That's going to be in greatest demand throughout the region, followed by swamp chestnut oak. So this is where it really lies. If you can grow these 2 trees, that would be ideal. but it's not always possible, as you'll discover. Green ash is another one, and I've thrown Shumard oak and black walnut in here. They're going to be very limited on bottomland sites. They tend to grow adjacent where the upland meets the bottomland, or maybe along the banks where there's better sand deposits. So you'll find a few of them, and they're certainly desirable when you do. Now, regarding the medium value trees, there's a whole host: bald cypress, red maple, sweet gum. I've thrown red maple in there. That's actually a variation of red maple. It's swamp red maple, Acer rubrum. I forgot the rest of the Latin name there, but it has a pubescence on the underside of the leaf. But it's common, as well as sweet gum. Now, there's additionally a number of oaks, water willow, and overcup oaks. Not necessarily high value species. The wildlife biologists would say that these are very good for waterfowl. So from that standpoint, they certainly have high value. And then pecan, shellbark hickory, as well as water hickory, which isn't listed there. That's pretty limited in the southeast. And then finally, the low value trees we prefer not to be growing: cottonwood, sycamore, black willow, river birch, swamp tupelo, pin oak, hackberry, box elder, and of course there are others, but these are the primary ones. So we want to try to push up this scale as best we can to grow these, and then eventually these, if you can. So let's turn our attention, I guess, to some silvicultural concepts here for the landowners and maybe non-foresters in the audience today. Let's just break that word down. We see the word silva, which is Swedish for forest trees. We see the word culture, which means controlling the growth of something. So we are controlling the growth of forest trees. And the silviculturists like to say that we practice that science at 3 different phases. There's the establishment stage, everything that goes into getting your bottomland forest started. There are the intermediate operations, which is what we do to the forest while it's developing. And then eventually the forest is regenerated. I'll just call that the final harvest stage here. What you'll find is that people get very excited about establishing forests, planting trees. That's pretty exciting. They get excited about harvesting the trees too. Of course, that's where the revenue is, most of it's generated. But oftentimes they overlook this intermediate operations, what's done in between the two. And so think of it this way: it's just like a garden. We plant the garden, we tend the garden, and then we harvest the garden. And that's all we're doing, but just on a more grand scale. So I'll say a word or two about each of these 3 legs of the triangle. There are some silvicultural challenges, of course, in the bottomlands that we don't face on upland sites. We primarily don't face. And of course, the first is just that overland flooding. We've got this massive influx of water that comes periodically, and that logistically can cause a lot of problems. And of course, we have poor internal drainage many times. So that leads to, as I alluded to earlier, this lack of oxygen. Trees need oxygen for respiration, and that's procured through the root system. And so if we have standing water that's stale, stagnant, the oxygen gets used up, and many species just can't tolerate that and they die. Of course, the microbial activity needs oxygen too. And also, of course, flooding can kill acorns and regeneration, young seedlings. And so I've been in the woods before after harvest in the bottomland, and you're very satisfied with the oak regeneration. And then I've come back to that same site 2 or 3 years later and can't find a single oak tree, and you're trying to explain what happened. And it comes down to growing season flooding can sometimes take them out. So we have to deal with that. Secondly, then, of course, there's the high water table. It's like a liquid hard pan. Think of a hard pan as more or less an impenetrable layer on upland sites. Of course, we have clay hard pans. Sometimes there might be a rock underlaying that's a hard pan. And in the bottomland, we have this liquid hard pan that prevents roots from penetrating deeper. And oftentimes these bottomland trees can blow over fairly easily because of that, because the roots are shallow and rotting along the surface. The other thing we have to deal with is soil compaction. I've alluded to that, but consider that 1 cubic foot contains 7.5 gallons of water, which weighs 62 pounds. So just 1 cubic foot weighs 62 pounds. Try to pick that up. But what if we had a 1 foot flood across an entire acre? That's 272,000 pounds. And what if it's one of those 6 foot floods? Now we're looking at over 1.5 million pounds of water per acre on these sites. And so you can see why the soil is heavily compacted, and it's difficult to plant, and it's difficult to get trees to survive in oftentimes, and how the water just moves very slowly. So, and then finally, of course, there are diverse soil properties, sand, silt, and clay in different percentages, and slight changes in elevation. So these are some of the challenges that we might have on bottomland sites that silviculturists don't have on upland sites. Well, I did some research down here at the research center. After these trees were planted, I was curious which ones were surviving the best and why. And so our soil scientists at the time said that the parameter we needed to be measured was soil modeling. And so you can see the definition of modeling there, but that's when water is removed very slowly and the soil is saturated during 3 or more months of the year. And what happens is that water sits there and the soil is saturated, you begin getting these gray colors that appear in the soil horizon. And of course, that's not normal, and that indicates an anaerobic condition. Now, when these gray colors become so significant that they represent 50% of the soil profile, that's when we say the glade matrix has met. And so I was curious which trees would survive in this glade matrix when we had 50% soil modeling, and also looking at that in terms of the depth that this glade matrix occurs. And so moving about 3 years worth of work and all kinds of publications forward, you'll eventually see what we came up with. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a soil probe with a Munsell chart. So this would be a situation where we have no soil modeling. So that's ideal. Just about all these bottomland species would grow just fine on that soil. Here we have a situation where the modeling has reached the point of 30% of the soil profile. So we haven't achieved the glade matrix yet because it's only 30%, but there's going to be some limitations there in terms of the drainage pattern. Now then, eventually we reach this 50% modeled, and you can see about 50% of the profile there is covered with this gray modeled soil. That's where we're going to have severe problems. That's considered poorly drained. And then something like that, very few trees can grow when the modeling is that intense. But at any rate, here's what we came up with on the study. Again, this is a summary. We just looked at oak species and the survival where we reached this 50% glade matrix, modeling glade matrix. And here is what it looks like. So 3 different columns. Let's focus on this column right here because this is that soil modeling, the depth to that 50%. So we've got 50% gray. And if that 50% gray occurs within the top 9 inches, that soil is considered poorly drained. And you'll see we had 3 species of oak that could tolerate that. We measured both height and diameter on this site. So none of those have real high value monetarily, maybe some good wildlife value. So then we drop down, and when this glade matrix reaches the 10 to 18 inch, we reached it in the 10 to 18 inch profile. We consider that somewhat poorly drained, and we could add into that willow. Now that's willow oak, not black willow as in Salix nigra. This is willow oak. And then finally, if the glade matrix was reached within at the 19 inch level, then that was moderately well drained, and there was a whole host of oak then that we could throw in there. Now, important to this is you can't move these species up the horizon here, but you can move others down. And so if it's moderately well drained, then essentially all these trees would do fine. But before we plant trees on this site, it's important to do some soil probing to determine where this glade matrix is and try to match the species to the soil profile. So those were the winners. And all this was summarized in this publication. And the study was conducted later in 2014, 8 years later, to see if things had changed. And for the most part, they hadn't changed. The early winners continued to be the new winners. And that publication, I think, Robert has included in the portal site there for you. Well, what are some options for managing bottomland hardwoods? We have some challenges. I've alluded to those. But particularly when we're harvesting timber, anytime we disturb the forest soil on these sites, that's going to increase two things. It's going to increase sunlight, of course. We've opened the canopy up, and it's going to increase exposed soil. And both of these, when worked together, particularly this exposed soil, this allows an issue to arise. And that's where the light-seeded species, these undesirable willows and cottonwood, sycamore, birch, box elder, and so forth, to invade. Because, of course, these are all small seeds, and they need to really land on bare mineral soil to germinate and to do well, because they don't, the little roots don't penetrate through much organic matter, leaves and so forth, if they just land on the top. But boy, when the soil's exposed, you open up a whole issue. And so the preferred species that we're looking for, of course, are these oaks that I've been mentioning. And preferred hardwood oak regeneration is very challenging to get on these sites. It comes via 4 different ways. Sometimes there is encroachment. In other words, after the harvest, there may be some seedlings that seed in. But if you're relying on that, you're going to be disappointed, because generally you'll have pretty poor regeneration of oak species if you just allow seeds to come in and establish the forest. Instead, what we prefer to have, this second bullet, is advanced reproduction. In other words, we want the oaks already there, the seedlings already there, and the taller the better. 4 feet or better is preferred prior to the harvest. That's what's preferred. The third method then is after the harvest. Sometimes stumps will sprout. We call that coppicing. And so that's a resprouting of the stump. And in some cases, those sprouts can grow up and become, mature trees, very large trees. But the general rule of thumb is that your success will be better on smaller stumps, so less than 16 inches or so. The reason for that is if you've got a 30-inch stump with a few sprouts coming off it, that stump was supporting a massive tree. And in order to have that massive tree, there was a massive root system. And these little bitty sprouts just can't produce enough sugar to feed the root systems. And so the root systems die. And so that's why these smaller diameter trees generally will give you better resprouting. Of course, normally we're not cutting these smaller diameter oak trees, so that may be a moot point. And then finally, there has been some success with actually planting back in these sites after they've been harvested. At the Ames Research Center, Dr. Houston and Dr. Schlarbaum have done some work where they're bringing in seedlings that are 4, 5, 6 feet tall, large seedlings, and planting them, and they've had some success. Understand that it's challenging. You're probably not planting as many trees per acre. It's time consuming and maybe expensive, but there's cost share assistance now available for that type of thing. And so that's something that might be appropriate for some people. Well, critical to oak reproduction is the following. And I'm really just repeating what I've just said. Essentially, it's the amount, the quantity of the advanced growth. In other words, the number of seedlings and the size of those seedlings. Those are the 2 most important reproduction factors for bottomland oaks if you want success. So here's your decision tool. Let's say you're wanting to harvest some overstory trees, but at the same time, you want to have good oak regeneration for the future. And here's your decision tool. If the advanced seedlings are there in a good enough abundance and they're tall, then you're free to harvest. Those trees, many of them should do fine. Even if they get smashed in the process, they've developed good root systems and they should come back. So that's preferred. If advanced seedlings are less than 4 feet tall, the reason why that's a problem is these other light-seeded species could come in and outperform them. And so they need a good start. So if they're less than 4 feet tall, then you might want to conduct a mid-story release where you actually come in and maybe deaden some trees, perhaps harvest some if they're harvestable. But you're trying to free up some sunlight to help boost these seedlings so they reach 4 feet tall. And then you harvest once you've achieved that. Now, if advanced seedlings are absent, then you can consider underplanting before the harvest along with a mid-story release. So underplanting, and then just like we did here, come in and actually kill some trees to free up some sunlight and then harvest. And then finally, and this is not well tested, but some have been involved in well-timed harvest that coincides with a good year of acorn production. and maybe even disking them in. I know Purdue University, I think, has done some of that on upland sites, but I can't tell you about the success they had with it. But that is maybe an option for some people. Well, in order for timber harvesting to occur, we're either thinning immature stands or we are regenerating mature stands, one or the other. And when you're thinning immature stands, that means it's pre-commercial. In other words, you haven't generated revenue from it. So thinning is determined by stocking, the stocking level. And foresters identify 3 different stocking levels, and that is overstocked, fully stocked, and understocked. Let me spend a moment here and just share with you some concepts about stocking. Understanding the term growing stock is central to the model that I'm preparing to show you. Think of growing stock as timber found in the forest that is not to be harvested at the moment, but is being held over either for future harvest or to protect and enhance other timber that is intended for future harvest. So in a broad sense, growing stock is either acceptable or unacceptable based on a number of factors. So let me give the refrigerator metaphor that I often use. We understand stocking when it comes to our refrigerator. We know at the end of the pay period, the refrigerator might be a little bit lean, a couple pieces of bologna and some leftover mashed potatoes. We know, as we'll discover next week after our Thanksgiving dinner, we've got more food than the refrigerator can hold. That's a situation where our refrigerator is overstocked. What we prefer to have with our refrigerator is about an 80% stocking level. In other words, there's plenty of food in there, but there's always room for some additional growth. And foresters apply this kind of simplified concept to the forest itself. So here's a stocking chart. Now, the foresters in the audience today, this is not the Gingrich chart. That's for upland hardwoods. This is a chart that was prepared from goals a number of years ago, and it's designed for bottomlands or bottomland forest. And so we've got a number of things going on here with all kinds of axes here. And you'll notice on the x-axis here that it indicates the number of trees per acre. So your forester would actually go out there and inventory it and determine how many trees per acre there are. Now on the y-axis, this is basal area. Now, let me briefly explain for the benefit of the non-professionals here what basal area is. So bear with me. Basal area is it's a metric that we use that tells us a lot about the stocking level of forest. So basal area is the cross-sectional area in square feet of a tree that's measured at diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet above the ground. So in other words, if you were to cut a tree off at 4.5 feet and then measure the surface area of this high stump, and then convert that to square feet. So here's the equation for basal area. And for instance, if we have a 14-inch diameter tree, it's 14 inches across, you plug it into the equation, and that 14-inch tree would have about 1 square foot of basal area. Now we can do that for all different size trees. And here's a table that kind of breaks it down further. So a 2-inch diameter tree would only represent 2/100ths of a square foot, or about 1/50th of a square foot. You can see a 6-inch diameter tree. A 10-inch tree would be about a half a square foot. There's our 14 again, and that's about 1 square foot of basal area. And 18, we can go all the way up to keep going, 36, 40, however big the tree is. Now, key to this is that I said a 14-inch tree has about 1 square foot of basal area, but 2-inch diameter trees, it would take about 45 of those to equal the same amount of square foot of basal area. So this applies to all sizes of trees and development of various stands. So looking at it another way then, foresters then add up all this basal area or square feet to come up with a per acre value. So pretend you're looking at it from a view. These are all those high stumps, and we measure all these and add all this up. And that gives us the total basal area per acre. That's what's plugged back into this table. So there's your basal area, 20, 40, 60, 80. You get up around 120 square foot of basal area, and you're dealing with a situation where your stand's probably getting overstocked or nearly overstocked. So then if you look at this axis, this is the stocking level. So you say 50, 60, 70, 100% stocking. So let's say your forester conducts an inventory and determines that this stand has 1,000 trees per acre at 75 square foot of basal area. Now, on upland sites, that would be ideal, but on bottomland sites, because of the rate they grow, this stand actually has reached 100% stocking level, and it's telling us that the growth rate is going to begin shutting down and some trees are going to die. So the forest is going to thin itself if you do nothing to it. But oftentimes we want to take control of this, and the forester actually recommends then let's knock it down to 70% stocking level, and that puts us right here. So we've gone from 1,000 trees per acre to about 650 trees per acre, and a basal area of about say 55 square feet, which puts us at 70% stocking. Now the average tree, that's what this final line is here. Before we did the work, it was about 3.75 inches in diameter, and we're a little bit larger now. So in time then, what happens is foresters basically manage this forest and just work its way through this stocking guide, trying to stay between this 60 and 100 square foot. So if we fall down here, that's our refrigerator that's understocked. We have too few trees per acre, and the trees want to bush out like yard trees instead of forest trees. And of course, if we're up in this area, that's our refrigerator after Thanksgiving dinner, and there's not enough space. So try to keep it right in here as we're managing the forest. So how do we do this? Pre-commercial thinning. There's a number of ways you can do it. I'm fond of what I call a double girdle method, no herbicide. So I use a chainsaw, cut through the bark, through the cambium, the phloem, and then get into that early wood, which is the xylem. And essentially that's going to cut the water flowing up to the top of the tree. I use a double girdle. Now, you can use a single girdle and apply herbicide to this, or you can use a double girdle without herbicide. And frankly, I find that's actually quicker, but there are some limits to it because it's only good for trees that are about 10 inches in diameter and smaller, because larger trees sometimes can bridge that gap. So what you're seeing right there is the photosynthate, or the carbohydrates that have been produced up in the crown of the tree. They're trying to come down and feed the roots, but they hit this zone that's dead right here. You can see the bark sloughing off, and eventually the roots have to die and the tree dies. And so within a few years, it looks something like that. Beneficial for wildlife because dead trees attract beetles. Beetles attract woodpeckers. They of course, cut this out, and eventually it becomes home for larger mammals and so forth. But you might prefer this method, which is the hack and squirt, and that's fine too. With a machete, you're going to roughly every 2 inches or so cut through that cambium layer and apply herbicide to this cut surface, and that's another method too. So this is pre-commercial thinning. So now I want to turn our attention to commercial thinning. Now, key to this is I want you to understand that what I'm covering here isn't just specific to bottomlands. Of course, this applies to uplands too, but why not cover it? Because we're managing bottomlands too. And so a number of years ago, Putnam and et al. Developed this system for categorizing standing trees when you're considering a harvest, a commercial harvest. Now, I want you to pay attention as we go through this, because there's going to be a little quiz poll at the end that you can participate in. Eventually we'll have 10 trees we go through. But let's go ahead and look at this. He identifies 4 different cutting stocks, or 4 different stocks, and the first is cutting stock. So let's jump into what I mean by cutting stock. Cutting stock are trees that are ready for harvest now. So you're looking at about a 36-inch diameter cherry bark red oak. Again, that's the king of the bottomland red oaks. If you're not going to be cutting this tree, then you're not in the business of growing timber. So this tree clearly is ready for harvest. It has reached its financial maturity. Actually, it becomes a high risk of loss, not only because a tree like that could blow down, but begin dying, but also because the center of that tree can start becoming doty or softwood, kind of spongy. And in some cases, the trees are too big for the mills to even handle. So we're going to cut a tree like that. If we don't, it may decline in value or just flat out die if we don't. So the next stock that's recognized is preferred growing stock. Now what you're looking at here is an 18-inch cherry bark red oak. This was left after a harvest. So they did a good job with this. This is timber. Preferred growing stock is timber with good investment potential. So there's 3 things that have to happen in order for it to be preferred growing stock. we want it to be the desirable species. And so we've got that with cherry bark red oak. Excuse me, we want to have good form and good grade. Now, what I mean by that, form is the relative straightness of the tree. And so sawmills naturally like straight logs because there's less waste. So that we want trees to be straight, have good form. And then also we want it to have good grade. So grade refers to the number of defects and their location, their abundance of them, and what type of defects. And so defects can include such things as butt bulge and burls and bird peck. Of course, knots are the major defect. We've got seams, whether they're lightning strikes or frost cracks. And then we have conchs, which are those funguses that pop out on the tree, indicating internal. Of course, there's a whole host of internal defects too, like mineral stain and ring shake and so forth. So defects, I actually created a webinar, and it's years ago, probably 15 years ago, on this same portal that covered hardwood log defects. Maybe it's still on there. Robert can maybe let you know if it is, if you want to go into more on defects. But at any rate, this is a preferred growing stock. We want to leave that tree. That's increasing in value exponentially. Here's another way of looking at it. If you look at these trees, these preferred growing stock, here's the size, here's the value, and that red line represents increase in value. So why do you want to cut something that's increasing in value at an increasing rate? Let's leave these trees as preferred growing stock. That's one of the problems with diameter limit cutting, which is another presentation in itself, that I'm adamantly opposed to diameter limit cutting in most cases, because these preferred growing stock trees get sacrificed in that system. Well, reserve growing stock is the next category. What you're looking at here is a 16-inch yellow poplar. So right away, it's not the most desirable species. It does have good form, it's straight, but it does not have good grade. You can see a lot of cat faces, knots, limbs on that tree. So it's really not the best tree. They are, however, healthy trees. They just don't meet the land ownership objectives. So it's not preferred maybe on this site. Generally, they're kind of medium to lower value trees due to just the fact of what they are, their species, or to their condition. But they're just left to maintain that desired stocking level. Remember, I said we want to try to achieve that 70 to 80% stocking level. So you have to leave some of these sometimes to make sure we don't overthin the forest. Sometimes they're just left to, in other words, to protect the preferred growing stock that you're trying to grow. Nothing better to release. As you look at this particular site, that's a poplar tree, and we've got sycamore and box elder growing next to it. So this is very subjective, and it's probably the most challenging to really determine whether or not you want to leave or take these type of trees. And then finally, the final category is cull stock. So cull stock are poor trees that just do not meet the management objectives. They're not needed to maintain the stocking. They can either be merchantable or non-merchantable. And what I mean by that, the base of this tree, this hollow at the base, is not merchantable, but if you sound that tree, once you get up about 6 feet, it's solid. So there might be something salvageable, like a railroad tie or a pallet log, or perhaps some pulpwood above that. Sometimes they may just have to be killed. The wildlife biologists like us to leave some of these too, of course, for wildlife. But what we want to be careful of is not to leave too many of them. And so I like to maybe, leave one an acre or so. But if we leave too many, that becomes high grading. That's where you take the best trees and leave the inferior ones. And that's not an acceptable practice in forestry, because it degrades the long-term productivity of the forest. So something to think about there. So which trees should be selected for harvest? According to a publication by Dr. Clatterbuck, we want to harvest all the cutting and most of the cull stock trees. So go ahead and pick those out first, and then stand back and look at what's left. And you're going to harvest very few of the preferred growing stock trees. That's why they are preferred. Sometimes you might have to throw some of those in just to make the sale attractive to potential buyers, but those are the ones we're trying to retain. And then the reserve growing stock, again, those are the ones that are more challenging. And some of them might be harvested, some of them might be left to grow. Of course, that's subject, again, to the stocking level. so we are ready for our poll. Robert, if you want to pull it up and explain it. You're going to answer these questions and then we'll explain it. I think he'll show the results in just a few more seconds. Okay. Yeah, that's a good call. It's for the most part, it's a call. I would call that an apartment complex. Actually, I think the argument could be made. Some people might call it a reserve tree or preferred if you're thinking wildlife. But I guess for the purpose of the discussion today, that's an example of a call. So let's see if we can go to the next one. Not sure how to do that. I think I have to close it out and then. Okay, it's not advancing, Robert. Oh, it's not advancing. I don't know if there's something you can do or I have to chat with me here.
Click on the slider, stop sharing your screen, and then reshare.
Oh my. Well, yeah, this is going to end up going too slow if we try to do it this way. It wasn't advancing. Can you see it now? Can you see the screen now?
Yeah, but it's not in. You need to go into
Okay.
slide presentation mode.
Okay, here's this next one. And let me tell you something about it. It's a 16-inch. This happens to be a red oak tree. It has one 16-foot log in it right now. Whoops, I just ruined it for you. Is this a cutting, preferred, or reserve stock, cull stock? Yeah, that's right. Preferred. Some might want to cut it, but boy, it's hard to turn loose of a 16-inch red oak. It's just now beginning to increase in value at an increasing rate. So most people are getting that. But these things just aren't advancing anything that I click, Robert. So maybe it is now. Okay. One of the reasons why it's preferred is it's going to throw on an additional 16-foot log by leaving it another 15 years. So it's grown in diameter and it has grown in length. That's great. So, okay, here we go. How about this one? That's Dr. Alan Houston. One of his 30-30s. 30-inch diameter at 30 feet, white oak. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm calling it, is a cutting stock as well. Of course, it depends on if your objectives are wildlife and so forth, but I'm making the assumption that we're growing these trees for timber harvest. So yeah, that is and it's not advancing again. I don't know what's happening, but it just freezes. That's the next tree. Pull that back up and see if they can see that, Robert. Your results.
Say that again, David. What would
Can
you
you
like?
pull it back up? It showed up on my screen when you did that. The picture showed up with the results.
Oh, you want to go back to the last poll?
No, on the next one, it's not advancing, and it showed up on my screen. The next tree did when you threw the poll up there. It's not going to work. I do apologize, but I think we're going to have to go on to the questions. Unfortunately, I did have a concluding slide though.
You can bring that up.
Yeah. Well, let's see if this shows up. That's kind of a good example.
So yeah, if you want to take it into,
Yeah, it's just not working. There it is. Okay. What I wanted to show you is an example of the benefits of being patient. And so 15 years ago, a forester came in and marked this sale and determined that these two cherry bark red oaks were actually preferred growing stock. On this bottomland site, they were both right at about 20 inches in diameter. And it was determined to leave those trees on this site. 15 years later, then the forester came back and had a follow-up timber harvest. That's the same two trees. That deer stand is that deer stand right there. And now they're roughly 24 inches and 25 inches in diameter. And that's why we leave preferred growing stock to, at some point, achieve cutting stock. And so here's the concluding slide. I'll let you read it. And there we have it. I'll end the show and I guess I'm ready. Go back to you, Robert.
all right, thank you. So folks, if you got question, I do ask if you type them into the Q&A. There's a couple in chat we'll ask, but as you guys get questions, please type them into the Q&A so we don't lose track of them. The first question that came in was from Trent, and Trent was wondering, what's the recommended herbicide rate for use in hack and squirt methods?
The number of milliliters I can't tell you, but it's just it doesn't take much. In other words, I typically use a squirt bottle, and on hack a squirt, it's just one squirt per hack, essentially. You just want to make sure that it reaches the cambium. Of course, if it's been girdled, then you spray it all the way around the girdle. You don't want to overdo it, certainly not to the point of runoff, just enough to kill the trees. So, and of course, that would be in the instructions too of the herbicide that you're using.
Okay, question from Caleb. How does the survivability of species like bald cypress or tupelo compare to oaks on the depth to 50% glade matrix scale?
Those are the ones that are most tolerant. In fact, that's what you see typically on the wettest of the wet sites. Sometimes they might stand water for the whole year. And swamp tupelo, bald cypress, and maybe some swamp red maple, particularly around the edges of it. But those two species, tupelo and cypress, are the ones that are most tolerant to that glade matrix.
Okay, let's see. Question from Dan. He's wondering, how do you feel about direct seeding as a restoration option?
I've done some of that, and it hasn't been successful for me. You really have issues with competition control. It's cheap, and you overplant is what we did. Instead of planting 435 trees per acre, you might be planting 1,000 seeds per acre on a 1 foot or whatever 5 foot interval. Of course, there's predation from wildlife too. I mean, sometimes the deer will paw them up, squirrels and so forth, small mammals. It has its place, but get ready for a lot of competition from weeds and so forth. The taller the seedling, the better if you're going to do it that way. It might have a little bit better success on upland sites, but I would say in bottomland sites, you'd probably have an issue.
Next question is from Test. What is the acceptable level of seedling or whips per acre for natural regeneration?
Well, NRCS, I believe their standard, their requirement is a minimum of 300 seedlings per acre. But of course, it depends on your objective. If you're wanting strictly wildlife habitat, then the wider spacing, more of a savanna type planting, wider spacing is better. Foresters typically use a minimum of around 10 by 10 spacing, which is 36 trees per acre. And that allows you to lose about 25% and still reach that NRCS minimum of 300 per acre. Of course, tighter spacing forces the trees up taller. As a forester, I'm interested in a nice clean bowl. I want to shade off those lower branches. but wildlife biologists might prefer more of an open canopy for mass production. So not a one size fits all answer to that question.
All right. It looks like we've gotten through all of our questions. Last call for questions from anybody. Here's a question from Michael. We discussed preferred and cutting stock for harvesting. What's the average mill diameter cutoff for diameter for products coming in?
It's different for pine than hardwoods. About 26 inches is the maximum they want most mills for pine. Hardwoods, where they would cut off, I'm not sure I can answer that, but it's probably in that 30 to 36 inch diameter range. It depends on if it's a circular saw or a band mill. And so, yeah, you can grow trees too big, but normally hardwoods are going to start going bad by that point anyway. So they're geared up more for that, 20 to 26 inch diameter preferred size.
All right, we have a couple more questions that have come in. Our problem is harvesting as only clear cutting is available. And that is a question from Albert Shaw.
I'm not sure I heard the question. Is he saying?
I think it might be more of a comment in stating that our problem is harvesting as only clear cutting is available. I think most times landowners are faced with the suggestion is to clear cut versus.
Oh, well, yeah, you want to be careful with that. That may be what you're told, but that's not always the case at all. It depends on the stand parameters. You saw that stocking chart, and if the stand is not mature, then why clear cut it? And so no, there's a whole host of other ways of harvesting the timber, shelter wood, and even single tree selection, crop tree release. And so no, I would work with a forester for sure if you're trying to make a recommendation on harvesting bottomland timber.
Okay, next question is from Boyce. Are there any challenges in hauling over bottomland soils?
Oh yeah. Oftentimes that's why they may want a 3 growing season contract. Upland sites, they might take an 18-month contract. Bottomlands, they may want 2.5 or 3 years, because there's whole years sometimes where you can't even access these sites. And it can be a real issue getting the equipment in and out. Of course, they have road mats that can be placed down, and watch the series on swamp loggers, and you'll see how they can do it. They can get creative and do it, but certainly water's a limiting factor on these bottomland sites, access.
All right. I think all of our questions have come in. So I do want to take this time to thank you, David, for presenting today's webinar. The webinar you mentioned about grading standing timber, that has expired on forestrywebinars.net. So
Okay.
no longer available. But if you ever decide you want to do another one, I'm sure this audience would love to hear it.
Okay, well, I'm a short timer. One leg's out of the door, so maybe we can get it in.
All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Please take time when you finish up here to go back and complete the survey. We'd appreciate that. That information goes to the Tree Farm and others who have put this together so that they have feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you.